Okay, so now let us take up the last part in the French Revolution. Summarizing this entire letter, this entire chapter, there are many different events which actually make up the entire French Revolution. Right from the idea of this first, second, and third estate, how the people in the third estate were actually oppressed, and because of they were the only estate who were paying all the taxes. Then the call for raising of the taxes by King Louis. Then we come to the event where the National Assembly is called, the meeting of the Estate General is called, and in that the third estate people they demand for one person, one vote, and that is refused. That demand is refused by King Louis, and because of that, the people belonging to the third estate, they get angry, they walk out from there, and then they go to the tennis court where they take the famous tennis court oath, and they take an oath to form a constitution for France. They do come up with a constitution for France, and they are able to force King Louis into becoming a constitutional monarch. Once that is done, slowly the power gets transferred to the Jacobins. The Jacobins become more powerful, and their leader Maximilian Robespierre he comes into control of France. And after that, we have seen that once he comes into control, there is a reign of terror. He even imprisons King Louis, and after a few months, King Louis is executed. His wife is also executed. The reign of terror is where we have seen many people getting executed through the guillotine by Maximilian Robespierre, whoever does not agree with them. And eventually, we have also seen that Maximilian Robespierre himself undergoes the guillotine because his people could not tolerate it anymore. That was the end of the reign of terror. Maybe the only positive aspect which came out in the French Revolution during Maximilian Robespierre was he abolished slavery. In all this, we have seen that the women also side by side are fighting for their own rights, even though they did not play a very active role in it. But they also, wanted a part of the revolution. They wanted their own rights. They wanted constitutional changes, and through all these struggles, only by the year 1946, almost 250 years after the revolution, was it that women actually got the right to vote in France. Then we have also seen slavery, which was a very active trade in France. How slaves were taken up from the African countries, transferred to the Caribbean islands. From there, again, the finished goods used to move to Europe, and the French port cities which were there used to actively engage in the buying and selling of this trade to a very profitable business for people, the slave trade business. So all these things are the various events which actually make up the total amount of French Revolution. The last part of this French Revolution is the coming of Napoleon Bonaparte as the Emperor of France. He becomes the King of France. Now, a little background upon about Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was very much like a dictator, very much like how Hitler was a dictator. In the same lines, Napoleon Bonaparte also was a dictator, but he was a very popular and successful French general. He was a military general, and were extremely popular in France because he used to fight many wars for France. He used to win many wars for France, and he brought a lot of glory to the nation. So the common people in France knew Napoleon, they knew that name, and in fact, they were very happy to see him become the emperor because they thought that okay, this is a powerful man, this is a man who knows France, and this is a man who will fight for the nation. Unlike the earlier kings who would only try to tax the people and make money for themselves, but Napoleon had a different idea altogether for France. He wanted to make France as one of the most powerful nations in Europe. That was his idea. And with this thing in mind, he started conquering neighboring areas. This was the idea of Napoleon. He started conquering neighboring areas. He wanted to expand the territory which was there with France, and he also introduced many reforms into the laws in France. He adopted a system of uniform weights and measures, means he brought a uniformity in the country. And then he brought in a law for protection of private property. He also instituted many modern laws which gave lots of freedoms to the people. So all these things, he did a lot of good work, but ultimately the main problem over here was he tried to conquer and acquire more territories into France, and due to this, the problem happened when he went into the Battle of Waterloo, and in this Battle of Waterloo, he was eventually defeated by the Russians. And in 1815, he was sent to prison. He was sent away from France and he was sent into prison to on an island. So this was the history of Napoleon Bonaparte. Even though he tried to do a lot of good things for France, but eventually he also could not succeed in making France the way he wanted to make this country. So, in conclusion, what was the impact of the French Revolution? What was the difference that this French Revolution created in the world? One thing was this feudal system or the old regime that we call it, the system of the first, second, and third estate. That thing came totally to an end. That system was totally ended by this French Revolution. Then we also saw that people who were occupied by the French, different countries, different colonies of the French, very similar to the British colonies. Similarly, France also had many different colonies. They also started realizing that France is no longer a country which is ruled by a king, and they also started asking for their own independence, which they got eventually. And there were many Indian people also, people like Tipu Sultan, kings like Tipu Sultan, people like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who took lots of ideas from this French Revolution. In fact, Raja Ram Mohan Roy used the ideas of the women in France who were fighting for their own rights. He used many of those and he championed the cause of Indian women over here in India. Tipu Sultan took in a lot of ideas of how a constitution would be formed, how people can be given a role to play in the government. He used a few of those in his kingdom also. So the French Revolution, by and large, if you see the ideas of the three tier of the government that we have, the legislative, executive, and the judiciary, all this is the result of the French Revolution. If it was not for the French Revolution, maybe democracy as we see it nowadays in our world, as you and I experience democracy, the freedom that we have in our everyday lives might have been totally entirely different. It might not be the way it is today if the French Revolution would never have occurred. So we need to learn our history so that we know our present and we can build our future. If we do not know our history, there is no way of knowing where we can go in the future, because the mistakes that we have done in our past, in our history, can be avoided only if we know what those mistakes were. If we do not know our mistakes, there is in no way where we can build a better future. That is why it is extremely important for us to know our history. I know many times many students, many children, they feel that history is boring. History has lots of dates. History has lots of people, very strange names and all that. But learn history like a story. Yeah, come again. Yeah, it is facts, correct. Definitely, history is purely made up of facts. But more than facts, there is a lot of learning that we get from this. It is experiences of earlier people, and if we don't know the experiences of earlier people, we will definitely make the same mistakes in our future. So to avoid those mistakes, we have to know our past, and if we don't know our past, we can never go into our future. So that is about the French Revolution. We have come to the conclusion of this first history chapter of yours, that is the French Revolution. If anyone has any doubts about this, you can please ask me now.
So, what is the meaning of colonized people?
Hmm. This word colonization.